We're going to be studying the question, what are atoms? Atoms. So here's a question for you. If I took this pen, I'm just going to draw a picture of a pen on here. Very bad pen, but you get the idea. And I cut it in half and took this part of the pen. That would be smaller, right?
Yes.
Okay, what if I cut it in half again? Took this part of the pen.
It'll be even more smaller.
Okay, what if I cut it in half again?
It will just keep on going more smaller.
Smaller, smaller, smaller. So if I cut it, just keep cutting it, cut it in half, smaller, 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 smaller. So back in the day, there were these fancy Greek philosophers. I can't remember their names, but there's a couple of them. And they asked each other the question, if we took objects and just kept cutting them smaller and smaller and smaller, would there eventually be a point where you couldn't cut it any smaller? Where it was like maybe you would get down to the basic building blocks of matter, and if you tried to cut it, it wouldn't cut, or it would change into something else. So one of these Greek philosophers came up with a name for these sort of theoretical building blocks, and he called them atoms. Okay? And the philosophers debated. Some said, hey, I think you can always keep cutting it smaller and smaller and it doesn't matter. And some said, I think you're going to get down to tiny little building blocks. So it's been a long time since those ancient Greek philosophers were alive. And now we know that there are actually things called atoms. Okay? So do you know what atoms are?
What are atoms? Atoms are very small building blocks of things. And atoms are made out of 3 different types of atoms. They are called protons, neutrons, and
Okay. So yes, they are very, very, very small, like almost unimaginably small. Okay. I think the other day I was with a different student, and we looked up, and I should have written it down, but it's something like, I'm just gonna look it up. Okay. How many atoms can fit in the dot of an eye? Okay, let's look at this one. Ooh, okay. So it says here, I'm not sure if this is the best source ever, but on the dot of an eye, right there, there are about 7.5 trillion atoms. Okay, do you know how big a trillion is? Huge. So there are, even though that's a really small dot, there's 7.5 trillion atoms in that dot. So atoms are very, 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 very small, okay? And they are the building blocks of matter, okay? So they're kind of like Legos for matter. All matter, kind of like Legos, all matter is built up, you can think of it as built up of tons and tons and tons of little tiny atoms clumped together like Legos. So these are the individual Legos building up the matter, okay? But they're way smaller than Legos. And they're also way more interesting than Legos, too. And so that's what atoms are. Now let's talk a little bit about what atoms look like, okay? So atoms are actually spherical, circular, like a basketball, you can say. Little tiny basketballs. And there's a couple of important distinct parts of atoms, okay? So one part in the very middle of an atom, let's pick a good color for this, let's pick a red, is called a proton, okay? Draw some protons in there. Proton. And the proton is located in the center, and we're going to talk about what the center of the atom is called in a second. Let's give it a brown color. Another part of the atom is called the neutron. Okay, these are some neutrons right here, and they're also in the center. And both of those, like I said, they're in the center of the atom. That's called the nucleus, okay? Located in the nucleus. And then flying around on the outside are some other particles called electrons. Have you heard of electrons before?
Yeah.
These are flying on the outside of the atom in all sorts of crazy patterns, which is too complicated to talk about in middle school, but they're on the outside, and they sort of make up the edge of the atom. Okay? So flying all over the place. Electrons. And then atoms are different. There's different numbers of protons in atoms, and so different numbers of protons makes different types of atoms that are called elements, okay? So, actually, that's a good drawing of what a basic atom looks like. You have a nucleus in the middle, then you have electrons on the outside, and those are the three important types of particles. It's electrons, protons, and neutrons, okay? But there's different types of atoms. We're going to be learning about these more in a project we do soon. And these are called elements, okay? Elements. Okay? Elements are made up of atoms that have different numbers of protons, okay? Oops. So can you think of, do you know of any of the names of the elements? One, which one?
What was it called? I forgot what it was called. I didn't write it down.
There's one that's really important that we breathe all the time. Starts with an O.
Oxygen?
Oxygen. That's one. And have you heard of carbon before?
Carbon.
Another one is helium. You spelled that right. Also, gold and silver are elements. So there's all different types of elements, and these all have different properties. Okay. And those different elements with their different properties are the building blocks of everything, okay? All right, any other questions about atoms or elements? Building blocks of everything. Or does that cover most of what you need?
It covers most of it.
Yeah, so remember, for the project, all you have to do is explain what atoms are in 3 to 4 sentences. And that should give you more than enough to write 3 to 4 sentences.
1, 2, there's no more.
There you go.
I just copy this on the iPad.
So it shouldn't be too bad.